I just want to tell you a little bit about us and how this happened. Some of you may have seen on the website for the Center for Fiction that we had little blurbs about us, but I'll tell you really quickly. I met Honor Molloy one night at Yaddo. Maybe I don't have to say anything else. Anyhow, what happens at Yaddo? Yeah. Okay. Honor is, we actually did fall in love for one night, and then we didn't see each other for a couple of years. Really true. And then we met again and fell in love again. She's the author of the autobiographical novel, Smarty Girl, which you'll get a taste of the way Honor writes in the way she reads. The great thing about the novel is it's like having Honor's voice in your head, which is a nice thing. I met Joe Goodrich, playwright. They're both playwrights and novelists, which is a little annoying. I met Joe in the crime fiction world, where he is a kind of bon vivant. He's a great, great guy. We just liked each other right away. He's the author of South of Sunset, 9 plays put together, and we did a little showing of those a while ago, which helped inspire us. My great friend, S.J. Rozan, just a novelist, really. That's actually not true, but she's also an architect. But she's won just about every mystery award there is possible. She's written 12 novels, I think. 15. But anyhow, S.J. and I met at a panel. It was a crime fiction panel, and we were on either end, and there were two, shall we say, sort of annoying writers in the middle. We didn't know each other, but we bonded over eye rolls. We literally have been great friends ever since. So the four of us have been meeting, like once a month, and we talk about writing. We talk about our own writing, each other's writings. We read parts of each other's work. We complain a lot. And we thought it would be sort of, we hope, fun for you to be as if you eavesdrop on our evening. We're not going to complain, though. We're just going to do the way we read each other's work in tandem. And that's pretty much it. We considered, I did say upstairs, we discussed the fact that we had considered many themes for our sort of opening night. Sex, crime, sex, and love, and we've ended up with something that's tamer, but we thought was sort of both funny and sweeter, and something we've been all talking about and writing about, which is time and place. So that's what we're going to do tonight, and I'm going to start. April 26th, 1979.
96 River Road,
Point Pleasant, Pennsylvania.
I've been falling. I tried to keep Annabelle from visiting, but she finally wore me down. She arrived with a cake. My 83rd birthday was coming up. She raised a fuss about the state of the refrigerator and the stove and wondered how I could live in all this mess. I told her it was my mess, I was happy here, and if she didn't like it, she could leave. Annabelle didn't leave. She cleaned the kitchen and aired out the rooms and vacuumed the rugs and threw out all the junk mail and did the laundry and mowed the front lawn and the backyard.
And then the day before she was scheduled to go home to Massachusetts, it happened.
I was coming back from the bathroom. I'd almost reached the bed when I fell. Annabelle heard me and came bounding up the stairs into my bedroom. She found me on the bedroom floor in my pajama bottoms, tears falling onto the brightly colored rag rug. She gasped when she saw the bruises on my arms and rib cage.
What's happened? Dad?
I've been falling.
She gently wrapped an arm around my bare shoulders. I told her about the dizzy spells. I told her I'd stopped driving, not because my license had expired and I was afraid I wouldn't pass the test, but because I wasn't sure I'd find my way home. I told her, so what? So what if I fell once in a while? I was still able to get up and get on with my life. I thought she'd yell at me again. I felt old and foolish. The tears started again.
Don't cry,
she said, squeezing my hand.
I'd seen my future. Goodbye to the house, goodbye to all the years I'd lived here with Annabelle's mother after we'd come back to America from France, and Annabelle was born and grew up, and we grew old, and Daisy died, and I got older and started falling. I wasn't crying about the future. I was crying about the past.
It's been disappearing bit by bit for some time.
I couldn't see Daisy's face anymore. Photographs were no help. They didn't look like her. I couldn't see the connection between the woman in the photograph and the woman I was trying to remember.
I was losing her again.
11 years ago, cancer wasted her to nothing. It stripped away her beautiful hair and turned the naked scalp to parchment. And one Tuesday night, cancer stole into her Doylestown hospital room and stilled her heart. Even as I'd held her, Daisy slipped into death's arms and out of mine. I was crying for her.
Imagine losing the one you love most in this world.
Then you know how I feel. You know how loss and grief can bite into you like winter wind off the Delaware. Then think of going through it twice. I sit in this empty house in the shadows of a cool spring evening. A fire burns in the hearth. Tomorrow, Annabelle and I leave for Massachusetts, where I will live with her and her husband Jim and be loved and cared for and hate every minute of it. My papers are ready for shipping to my alma mater, a small college in the Midwest. I'm a historical figure by some standards, a living relic of a bygone era, 1920s Paris. I'm sitting at my cleaned out desk, the one we shipped back when we returned from Paris in 1940. I make these notes with the familiar fountain pen. When I pause to search for a word, I look out over the back lawn to the Delaware Canal. I feel myself dissolving into the dusk. I feel nothing. I am nothing. Nothing but the fragile container of a few thoughts and habits that will soon disappear.
Like this life.
Like my love.
Like Daisy,
It's all fading.
all
Fading.
Away.
April 27th, 1979.
The fierce electric shock of it. The fog has lifted. I feel like Lazarus brought back from the dead. I feel like someone who can raise the dead. Last night, I couldn't sleep, so I went for one last tour of the house. I started in the attic and wound up in the basement workshop. The paintbrushes and hammers and chisels had been taken down from their pegs.
The room was empty.
Except for a trunk pushed far back under the workbench.
The old trunk was furred with dust and cobwebs, the lock broken. Inside it were photograph albums, manila envelopes bulging with manuscripts and articles, boxes containing photographs, postcards, souvenirs. The chill of the basement seeped into my bones, but nothing could have torn me away from sorting through the scattered pieces of a life.
None of it meant a thing.
The photographs were as dead as the people in them. At the bottom of the trunk was a long, narrow leather box. I opened it and found
Daisy.
Marcel called this phenomenon of the past suddenly recaptured involuntary memory. For the narrator of Remembrance of Things Past, it was caused by the taste of a Madeleine dissolved in tea. For me, it was the look, the feel, the very scent of Daisy's white satin opera gloves. I wasn't kneeling on a concrete basement floor in an empty house. No, I was in Paris with my darling. The gloves are draped over the edge of her dressing table. Daisy reaches for them. I watch her pull one glove on, then the other, rolling and smoothing the satin along her arms, then holding them out to study them in the tremulous gaslight of our bedroom on the Rue de Guerre. Pleased with what she sees, she turns to me and smiles. Under the box with Daisy's gloves was an aging manila envelope. I undid the clasp and found a photograph and a notebook. The photograph was of a gawky young man in a tuxedo standing next to a confident young woman in an evening gown. He's tall, terribly thin, with Harold Lloyd spectacles and a military-style brush cut.
That young man is me.
And there, with her crop of honey hair, slim of form and pale of skin, is Daisy.
The photograph captured us in a moment of party conversation, caught up in the sheer pleasure of being with each other. The notebook is mine. Its fragile pages were yellowed and the ink had faded badly, but I could still make out what I'd written in April of 1919.
Dearest love, here's what happened and why. Read it when you can. Your Ned, who only and ever loves you.
The sky was a light gray over the canal when I finished reading. Rain had fallen before sunrise. I lifted a window to cool air and the smell of grass clippings. A groundhog nosed its way across the backyard. I sat for a time thinking over what had happened 60 years before. I thought of our years in Paris. I thought, of course, of Marcel. Most of all, I thought of the time my wife had committed murder. Dublin, 1969.
When I was 8, climbed aboard Aer Lingus, took off for the States with my mother and sisters and brothers. Uncle Walter collected us at Kennedy Airport. In the passenger seat, Mam cuddled wee sheet Noel. Squashed together in the back were 5 more Molloys. We'd left 1 Molloy behind, our dad. Had to run, Mammy said, because he was sick. Drinking all the time. Raging at us all the time. Bashing our mam all the time.
Night was rising. Uncle Walter doled out Cool Whip bowls. There are puke buckets here for the children.
Afraid one of us would have a spilly up, because we were driving straight through to Pennsylvania. A taxi cab drew up alongside. Taxi man was a chunky Italian, elbow propped casually in the open window. I propped my arm on the car door, casual like. It was Labor Day weekend, 1969. I'd come to America for the rest of my life. We unloaded at midnight. Uncle Walter collected the puke buckets. No one had boked. We scuttered up the steps to a 2-room flat the shite end of town. Living on Irish time, we woke at 5. On the kitchen table, a bright yellow box, something called Cheerios. Tasted like plaster. Inside a gigantic fridge was a gallon jug of watery blue milk. Low fat. So Mammy sent us off in search of food. My big brother Simon and me invaded the neighbourhood. A slum. The Allentown jail loomed over squat row houses and Rafferty's grocery.
Rafferty, behind the counter.
Must have looked like we'd walked out of the last century. Simon in Gansey short trousers, me in the tweed pinafore, pair of us loose socks, round-toed sandals. I like milk, eggs, bread, and give me some rashers.
You kids from Ireland? He was an easy, smiling man.
How'd you know?
Oh, my grandmother was from Ballylickey. Rafferty led us about the place, loading our arms with groceries.
Wonder what this is. Bread? Marshmallow, more like. Polka dots on the bag? Go away. What about the rashers?
Rashers?
Meat from a pig, comes in strips.
How about this?
He gives me a red and yellow package. Oscar Mayer. With a see-through window in the back. Quite fat with a teeny stripe of red. Stuffed rashers. Rashers come in raw slabs, piled on brown paper. Whole pig swung in McGill's window. Blood spilled on the sawdusty floor. Cow's eyes up for sale. Grim butcher, white smock smeared in amino blood.
Well, what about this?
Rafferty plunked down a plastic packet. Circular stack of pinky meat. Oscar Mayer again.
At the flat,
You brought me bologna? Mammy says. I asked you for rashers.
Didn't have any.
Of course they have bacon.
What's bacon?
Rashers!
Rafferty's daughter, Tootie, was in 3rd grade, like me. She ordered me to throw out my Bradley sandals because they were square. Square, a new word. Then Tootie gave me a pair of purple plastic shoes. They were smashing. I clattered round our apartment in them groovy shoes, dancing in my butterscotch frock for my American gran. When I pulled that frock down over my head, I pulled on an American South. After school, Tootie and I were playing dolls from around the world. Dutch girl with the wooden shoes and blonde plaits. Spanish Nina in her flamenco rig out. The Irish Colleen had 8 freckles on her face, 4 on each cheek, roaring red hairs down to her bum. Tootie was a redhead too. She had so many freckles, it looked like diseases.
I have red hair, like this doll. I have freckles, like this doll. So, I'm more Irish than you.
I was born there. Terrible fake of a girl. Only put up with me because her daddy forced her. Lucky she had a daddy. So, we punched her in the eye. Our final Patrick's Day, we got caught in a peace demonstration bound for the north. The Molloy kids marched all the way to Bray singing, "We shall overcome." 1 year later, deep in the Allentown Paddy's Day crush, the green hair, green donuts, the pots of gold, shambolicals. I wanted no part in this version of my nation. Within 6 months of our landing, I lost the accent, dumped the tweed, and drowned myself in Yankee slang.
May 1965, Jericho, Long Island.
Today, I am a man.
Was there ever a more absurd quotation applied to a 13-year-old, voice-cracking, shadow of a beard beginning, whose every thought is interrupted by the need to jerk off?
I look at the pictures from my bar mitzvah and see a big-nosed boy with carefully parted hair, and the days, weeks, months leading up to the event unfurl like a Torah scroll. By this time, we'd been living on Long Island for almost 5 years, and my father, who'd made a lot of money in the garment industry and was still a few years away from losing it, had reserved the now defunct Boulevard nightclub in Forest Hills, Queens, a year in advance. Not that my dad was particularly religious. I don't think he went to temple other than the High Holy Days, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Kippur, excuse me. But he was a See where it happens? But he was a cultural Jew who loved to spend money, and this just was not any excuse to spend, but a godly one. At the time, there were only a handful of Jews in Jericho, and my father, an obvious visionary in regard to Jewish evolution and migration, anticipated the need for a temple and corralled the 24 or so Jews in the neighborhood who, together, rented an abandoned mansion, chipped in to buy a Torah, hired a rabbi and a cantor, and a temple was christened, though I suspect that's the wrong word.
Still, money was tight, not enough to hire a Hebrew school teacher, and so the cantor, an acne-scarred youngish man with a personality like sharp mustard, did double duty.
Of my actual Hebrew school lessons, I remember very little other than the setting. The mansion's dining room converted into a quasi-classroom with chairs and a blackboard on wheels. But as one of the 2 bar mitzvah boys with a bar mitzvah looming, I spent most of my time in an upstairs bedroom with another 12-year-old memorizing prayers in our specific portion of the Bible known as the Haftorah. The room, yet to be converted, had a double bed, a hanging chandelier, flock fleur-de-lis wallpaper. Not the most conducive environment for Talmudic study.
The other bar mitzvah boy, let's call him Mike, had moved to Jericho a few years after he did. I'm not sure how their parents became friends, but it must have been some form of Jewish geography, friends of friends or relatives.
Mike was an obnoxious kid. He'd only become popular due to his father's not-so-secret stash of pornography. One has to remember this was eons before internet porn, even decades before big screen porn.
Mike's father's porn was vintage stuff, pre-war or post-war, referred to at the time as French films. Black and white with bad lighting, naked men wearing thin argyle socks and even chewing gum.
There were two of these films, both burned onto the back of my teenage brain. In one, a gum-chewing dame can't get her partner hard, and so, after a few minutes of tugging and sucking, the soft man is substituted by a hard one, a completely different man, who rises to the occasion. In another, a classic gangbang, 4 men and 1 woman, so totally distracted that at one point she studies her nails while being violated both front and back. All the men wear creepy Halloween-type masks, and the one I remember had an enormous cock, which he used as a battering ram on the bored woman to absolutely no effect.
Mike's dad also had pornographic comic books, magazines, and his personal favorite, 2 decks of playing cards with graphic pictures of every conceivable sex act.
For several years, a group of us boys would meet after school when Mike's parents were at work. Our routine, always the same. First, the comic books, magazines, and cards were passed around, a sort of preview of coming attractions. Next, Mike would loop a film onto his father's 8mm projector. Lights were dimmed. We'd all get comfortable around the room, separate but only a few feet apart. So this was my fellow Bar Mitzvah, son of a porn maven, with whom, for 2 days a week, I was stuck in the bedroom of an ad hoc temple to memorize Bar Mitzvah prayers while the cantor downstairs was teaching Jewish lore to the younger kids. And so, this one time, it was January, the room was overheated. I can still hear the hiss of the steam and the clanging pipes. Mike had smuggled in one of those decks of pornographic playing cards, and it wasn't long before he whipped out his dick and I followed suit.
After all those basement circle jerks, they didn't have much modesty or shame about side-by-side masturbation.
And so, there we were. On that lumpy bed, 2 12-year-old boys with our pants down around our ankles, shoes still on, Mike's white bucks, my penny loafers. This was decades before Nikes, but we were forbidden to wear sneakers in Hebrew school. Of course, we were not necessarily allowed to masturbate in Hebrew school, but I don't think there was a rule against it. Mike had already finished and was urging me to hurry as our Haftorah study hour was almost up. And so I started going a little faster and faster, and it worked. I was ejaculating as the bedroom door opened.
Did his semen hit the cantor in the face?
Probably not.
But it's possible.
I know he recoiled.
This was followed by a lot of scrambling, attempting to tug my pants up over my boner, a 1950s word. I still like that word, it's so descriptive. The cantor, hand pressed to his chest like he was having a heart attack, muttered something in Hebrew, then switched into English.
You boys are going to hell!
Something he could not possibly have meant, because everyone, especially a cantor, knows full well that Jews don't believe in hell. While the cantor's face went from red to deep crimson, a vein in his forehead throbbing, Mike and I started laughing. Then we pulled ourselves together, hurried down the stairs, out the back door, and ran until we were out of breath. A few blocks from home, we made a pact. We would never breathe a word of this to anyone. We figured the cantor wouldn't either, that he'd be way too embarrassed. That night, during dinner, the phone rang. My mother answered, frowned, and handed the phone to my father.
The cancer.
I can still see my father, phone pressed to his ear, nervously smoothing a hand over his thin dark hair while he says things like,
He what? When? But can he stay in Hebrew school until his bar mitzvah? Can't this be worked out? What did you say to the cantor?
What did I say?
You heard me. You cursed at the cantor.
I take a moment to digest this. The cantor was too embarrassed to tell the truth. I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean to curse, but Mike and I were fooling around and...
You cursed in a temple.
My father is up now, shaking his fist.
Do you understand that I am one of the temple founders and you are being expelled from it?
Expelled? I'm pretty sure he means expelled, but I don't correct it.
How can I show my deal with your son?
You will apologize to the cantor. Maybe he will relent and let you back into Hebrew school. Cursing in a temple. What next?
Yes, she The next day, I slipped my carefully scripted note into the cantor's mailbox.
Dear Cantor, I'm sorry about yesterday. It will never happen again. Sincerely yours.
Then I pray to a God, one who would surely expel me from heaven. That if my mother calls to check up on me, the cantor will say I've apologized without explaining how. When I get home, I tell her that he said no, I cannot come back to Hebrew school.
You have embarrassed your father. You are grounded for a month, and for each time you curse, I will deduct 50 cents from your allowance.
There is talk of getting me a Bar Mitzvah tutor, but I convinced my parents it's simple memorization, that I'll be diligent in my study. Catalogs from companies that make recordings of Bar Mitzvah prayers, companies that obviously cater to expelled Jewish boys, are consulted and 45 RPM records are ordered. But rather, get this, rather than the 3-page long Haftorah that I've been assigned in Hebrew school, the one that coincides with my birthday, I ordered the Haftorah from the month after my birthday because it's less than a half of a page. I pray once again that no one notices. When the records arrive, my mother lays down the law.
You are to be in your room memorizing the prayers for at least 1 hour a day as if you were actually in Hebrew school.
I don't argue, how can I? Every day, I turn on the record player. I put one of the 45s onto the turntable. The record spins. The needle picks out the sing-song Hebrew. I recite the first phrase, lift the needle, and repeat it. But after a few minutes, I get bored. I lie down on my bed, and within seconds, one of those obscene black and white movies begins to play on the small screen of my brain. And in the comfort and privacy of my own bedroom, much better than the dusty bedroom of that ad hoc mansion temple, I do exactly what I was thrown out of Hebrew school for doing.
Summer 1974.
I was a Dublin rotter, an untamed Wilden rotter. July mornings I rose with the sun, slashing the lap, scrambled out the window, down the elderberry tree, and into the day. Screamed my lungs out, shot my voice to hell in Stephen's Green, messing with a gang of scrubby kids from the north side, tormenting the Jesus out of the gardeners, taking every dare. I was the bold one, in both Irish meanings of the word, naughty and brave. After my kid gang went home to their tea, I zoomed up Kildare Street to the National Library. No children allowed. So I sat on the bench outside wagging my sandals, waiting on my mam. She'd be upstairs in a gigantical room of books, writing a book, her book. Once done, her smile burst out the library doors, and it was through the black iron gates with YRARBIL, that's library backward, arching over our heads. Although we had books and books and books in our tiny Dublin house, it's nothing compared to what we found when we got to America. Books a zillion on loan at the Allentown Public Library. The joy of the library visits. Saturdays, the Molloys stocked up for the week, towers of books in our arms. I remember a summer reading program. For each book you read, a librarian placed a sticker on a squiggling, multicolored bookworm. The one summer, I read 120 books. But some jerk Bob won first place with 150. Cheater. I remember that was about the time that my auntie Thalia taught me the word lugubrious. And that was the time I went to work. I was 12. Manpower had a job program for the disadvantaged, they called us, whole family, workless and poor. But I got paid $1.60 an hour to work at the high school library. The librarian, Sterling Silver, was a humpy-backed guy who had warty bumps running up his arms. Spent hours and hours behind his desk gnawing the end of a bright yellow Bic banana pen. They were in every pencil cup. I mean, the place was an ad for Bic bananas.
Comes in colors and it's only 29 cents.
Beginning of the summer, Sterling set the major tasks for the coming weeks.
Alphabetize the entire card catalog.
Interfile the cards for the new acquisitions.
Match the cards to the books on the shelves, paperclip the cards for any books that were missing.
And conduct a complete inventory of every last book in the library. I was assigned to count the books shelf by shelf with my older brother Simon. We didn't mind because this gave us the privacy and the time to read. Plus, we got paid for it. Far in the stacks, each perched on a footstool, we'd pluck our books from the shelf where we'd hidden them the day before. Read for 50 minutes, then count madly for 10. Sterling never stirred from his desk, but chewed his pen, head down in a book of his own. Most thrilling was the closet for oversized art books. That closet was crammed, only space for one. You must understand, I had so many sisters and brothers and friends and neighbors and classmates and friends and so much to do. My life was loud. My life was packed, was never alone. In that dark closet, I was in my lone and loved it. Paging through an art book, I noticed the nudes had crude swimming suits drawn over their vulgar bits with the wet blue ink of a Bic banana. Outraged, I searched through the art books to find that Sterling had defaced all the naked bodies from cave paintings to Lucian Freud.
There were bras on Brocks.
Moves on Matisse's.
Panties on Picasso's.
And the David was sporting a spanking new pair of
Fruit of the Loom cotton
briefs.
It was the 70s. The world was finally liberated, and here's this prude wielding his Bic banana like a scythe through canvas. The next day, I was moving a few books when a magazine slipped out from between Cubism and Futurism. Slid to the floor. Whoa, wow, wow.
Porn.
Porn.
Playboy was highlights for children compared to this.
Planet Slick was a slutty little raunchy rag with page after page of the naked and the splayed. Spikadelic hippie whores with their smudgy eyes pleading, hair all teasy like their pouty lips. Always wondered why there were no Bic banana bikinis on them babes. After that, I took to the closet whenever I could for a jolt to the core. That's why they call it core. Digging it. Dipped into deviance for a while, then snuck Planet Slick exactly back snug between Picasso and the future. The money I saved from working in the William Allen High School library paid for my return trip to Ireland. Was 20 when I flew home to Dublin that first time after. Went to the National Library every day for 6 weeks to read Irish writers. I started each working day by stepping upon the foyer's circular floor mosaic, Sapientia, the emblem of the owl, wisdom, knowledge. High in the domed light of the reading room, tucked in, desk with my very own lamp, the shade of green, ratter of glass on the roof, ratter of rain on the glass roof, air in there, color of rivers. Done with my Joyce, my O'Casey, my Sing for the day, through the black iron gates and arching o'erhead, YRARBIL. In Queens.
My bar mitzvah was a two-tiered event. Prayers first, party second. The prayer part took part in the mansion temple.
He's pretty sure his father made a sizable donation.
The second part was at the Boulevard nightclub on Queens Boulevard, a glitzy nightclub come catering hall, though simply by its location in Queens as opposed to Manhattan, second rate. Still, my parents were trendsetters.
This was long before over-the-top bar mitzvahs became de trop.
And they did it big. A lavish cocktail hour followed by dinner for 200, a candle lighting ceremony, a 6-piece band, ending with a 30-foot Viennese table with enough desserts to bring on several diabetic comas. At the time of my bar mitzvah, my father was a whopping 38. A tough boy from Queens who'd worked days to put himself through CCNY at night, had made good in the schmata business, and this was his moment to show everyone just how good. Almost every woman at the event was wearing one of my father's dresses. No, he was not a transvestite. He was a 7th Avenue man, a garmento, fitted Italian suit, black loafers, hair slicked back with throw cream, a star sapphire ring on his pinky. All of this dandy accoutrement on a short, thick, macho man who took shit from no one.
The bar mitzvah proceeded as planned, up to a point.
We'd gotten through the 2-hour cocktail hour, and the band was playing a lousy cover of Mac the Knife, and my sister and I were doing the Philadelphia Lindy, which is what the kids on American Bandstand did. Then my mother, a former Roxy girl, a Roxyette as they were called, a poor relation of the Radio City Music Hall's Rockettes, took the stage. Though her Roxyette days were far behind, she was now a whopping 36. She never missed an opportunity to dance up a storm, particularly at family weddings and bar mitzvahs, where she would perform her trademark Russian Kazatsky, which included athletic floor spins, splits, her dress hiked up to her thighs, while my sister and I cringed. And she did it that night, pulling out all the stops.
It was after that the band took a break, and the lights dimmed, and a spotlight captured a couple in the center of the stage. There were whispers and raised eyebrows.
Who are they?
Which grew louder when the man and woman started their dance. The man throwing the woman to the floor and beating her up, Apache style. While the woman emitted coy shrieks, my mother made a beeline for the manager's office.
My mother returned, leaned across me, and hissed to my father.
When we changed the date of the bar mitzvah, we forgot to cancel the floor show.
My parents both glared at me. If you've been paying attention, you may remember that shorter Haftorah I ordered by mail. Well, by the time it was discovered that the record company had sent me the wrong Haftorah, by mistake of course, I claimed it was too late for me to learn a new one. And though the temple and nightclub dates were changed, no one thought to cancel the regular Saturday night floor show.
The couple finally finishes their dance. Then a hidden announcer introduces the next act, Lonnie Satin, a singer who'd had a moderate hit song, Soul Bossa Nova. Lonnie takes the stage, a Johnny Mathis wannabe, his voice sliding up and down the scales as he goes through 5 or 6 songs. And for a while, it looked as though the floor show wasn't going to be so bad after all.
Then, it was time for the headliner, Maury Amsterdam.
Remember him? Maury Amsterdam from the Dick Van Dyke Show? A sort of goofy, sweet, tough guy comedy writer with a lisp, who worked with Dick and fed jokes to Rosemarie, the hard-edged dame with the little bow glued to the side of her shellacked hair.
Well, Maury was not so sweet that night, and with the spotlight in his eyes, I don't think he had any idea until way too late that he was playing to a bar mitzvah and not his usual Saturday night crowd.
So, the farmer's daughter says, I'm so hot, if you can get that ear of corn in and out of my cunt fast enough, we'll have us some popcorn.
I don't remember the entire joke, just the punchline.
The crowd is dead silent.
My mother takes off again. Maury continues.
So, the dad says to his little boy, Sonny, you know what a cunt is, right? And the kid says,
No, Daddy.
So the dad brings him into his bedroom, lifts up the blanket where his wife, the kid's mom, is sleeping, raises the mom's nightie, aims a flashlight, and says, You see there, Sonny? That damp, dark spot?
Yeah, Daddy, I see it.
The dad says, Well, Sonny, that's called a vagina, but everything around it, and now the dad waves the flashlight at every other part of his wife, now that, son, is a cunt.
Morty snorts and laughs, but there's not a sound.
Knock, knock. Anybody out there? I can't get it.
My mother huffs back to the table.
The manager says he'll signal Maury to cut it short.
It's way too late for that.
My father's face is a frightening shade of red that will predict the massive heart attack he'll have in 2 years. But still, Maury might have gotten away with it had it not been for my 4-year-old cousin, the sweetest, sad-faced kid you ever saw, who, all decked out in bow tie and shorts, walks to the edge of the stage and stands there, gazing up at Morty until the comedian does a hokey double take.
Damn! Is the audience getting younger or am I getting older?
My little cousin just stands there.
So, what's your poison, kid? Scotch and soda or root beer float?
There's a bit of nervous laughter from the room, but my cousin, not a word.
Hey, kid, can't you see I'm trying to earn a living here?
My little cousin does not budge. Maury lifts his hound dog face to the crowd and says,
That's it. Where the hell is this brat's father?
And with that, my sweet, sad-faced 4-year-old cousin says, My daddy is dead. You have never heard such silence.
Then everything is moving fast. Maury is escorted off the stage, the house lights are on, the Viennese dessert table is wheeled out.
Once again, my mother goes into action, dashing toward the stage, scooping up my little cousin, and delivering him to his mother, the grieving widow. A beautiful woman with teal blue eyes and jet hair, wearing one of my father's dresses, appropriately black. Less than a month earlier, her husband, my mother's brother, a man of 34, had gone into the hospital for what was then experimental open heart surgery and had died on the operating table, leaving my 4-year-old cousin, an even younger brother, and an entire grieving family stunned. My bar mitzvah was the first time they'd all been together since sitting shiva at our Long Island home. I can still see the covered mirrors, the torn black ribbons pinned to clothes, my mother's face pale without makeup, the low wooden benches for sitting, the family gathered together, eating, sharing stories, alternately laughing and crying. The band comes back and plays a rousing horror, and everyone tries to get back in the mood, and after that there were more cha-chas and lindies and foxtrots, and people seemed to be enjoying themselves, all except my widow aunt, who remained seated at her table and chain smoked. Less than a year later, she married a man who separated her from our family, who abused her and her children, and she died before she was 50 of too many cigarettes, missed opportunities, and if you ask my mother, a broken heart. Recently, I saw my cousin, now a grown man, who lives alone in the Arizona desert. I said, I remember your mother was so beautiful. He looks up at me with the same big blue eyes of that little boy in bow tie and shorts and says, Really? All I can remember is the way she looked before she died.
Paris, 1919.
I'm with the corpses again. The sky is a swirling wound. Slogging through the mud, crazed with hunger and thirst, I stumble toward the barbed wire of no man's land. My feet are raw meat in my boots. Each step leads me deeper into a stew of sewage and severed limbs. The gore rises over my boots, and I'm sinking. My mouth fills with shit and maggots. My head goes under. I can't breathe. I can't see. Daisy held me as I screamed. She held me until I came back to this world and left behind the ungodly mess of war raging in my skull. I lay there sweating and panting. I clung to Daisy until my breathing slowed and my crazy whirl of thoughts spun to a halt. I don't know why you stay with me.
I love you.
Sometimes I think you've been sold a bill of goods. Me. You could have anyone you want.
I don't want anyone else. Try to get a little rest.
If Collier's would just buy another story, we'd be in silk.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
We could pay the rent,
We could pay the butcher.
the baker.
Glad we don't own the the candlestick maker, or we'd be in trouble.
Talk of money had destroyed any chance of getting back to sleep.
Don't get up.
I've got to get to the paper.
For God's sake. You're falling apart.
I shuffled down the hall to the bathroom. I heard the concern in her voice and the irritation. The past few months had taken a toll. The long hours at the paper and the nightmares had turned me into a pallid version of myself. I was drinking too much. My temper flared at the slightest provocation. I jumped at the sound of an automobile backfiring or the squealing brakes of the metro. I'd even yelled at Daisy, God forgive me for it.
I said to the reflection in the bathroom mirror,
I didn't believe in God, but here I was asking for his help. I rested my forehead on the cool glass of the mirror. Waves of exhaustion rolled through me. I ran hot water and put my shaving brush in the basin to soak. Then I went to start the coffee. I was sleepwalking with open eyes. Every step took an eternity. I might never reach the kitchen. I might be dead and not know it. God, for some reason that struck me as funny, and I laughed. It was the first I'd laughed in weeks.
Ned.
Draped in my paisley robe, Daisy in the kitchen doorway, hair tousled, sleepy-eyed, barefooted, she made that robe look like it came from sulcas. A pang of desire stirred in me. Yeah?
Please don't be upset when I say this, but
She sat at the little table by the window.
you're killing yourself. I can't take it much longer.
My anger flared like a grass fire. I tamped it down.
I know you don't like it, but I could always ask Daddy.
No.
He'd help us.
I'd jump off the Eiffel Tower before I took a cent from that your-old man. I choked back another gush of anger and stormed out of the kitchen. In the bathroom, I furiously stirred the mug of shaving cream and silently cursed Daisy's father, a shanty Irish son of a bitch who'd come into a bit of money and thought he was Andrew Carnegie. The warm lather on my face was comforting. I drew the razor methodically over cheeks and chin and throat. How easy, I thought. How easy to slice the jugular and let my problems bleed into the sink. I took a clean shirt and a fresh collar out of the dresser, tied my tie with shaking hands, lifted my hat off its peg.
I studied the bleary figure in the mirror. Her corpse was presentable.
Daisy was still in the kitchen. I poured 2 cups of coffee. She didn't acknowledge me. She gazed into the street below.
A fat man in a blue smock and a beret waddled into a bakery at the end of the block.
I sat across from her. We might have been 2 strangers at the opera.
Drink your coffee before it gets cold.
She stared out the window.
The fat man toddled out of the bakery, carrying a large white paper bag.
Daisy,
I waited for her to say something.
The man took greedy bites of pastry as he wobbled along.
I'm talking to you. I swept the coffee pot off the stove and into the sink with a clatter of metal, an explosion of coffee, and a spray of grounds.
Only then did she look at me.
The anger in her eyes. I realized she was as tired as I was of our life here and of the troubled and childish man she'd married.
She walked out of the kitchen without a word.
A moment later, I heard her close the bedroom door.
I cleaned up the mess and left without saying goodbye.
Finally,
50.
okay?
Shanghai, spring, 1943.
Elena stood on the garden bridge and regarded the blooms bobbing and slipping between sampans and barges. Pale blossoms, so fresh their velvet petals still curled, floated on the clogged black river. Soon, water from a ship's wake would soak them. Iridescent oils splattering off a bargeman's pole would stain them and weigh them down. Or the rain, curdling now out of the cold mist, would pound them under. Elena had watched all of it happen before. None of the river's flowers ever traveled far. Most did not get beyond the harbor. Very few escaped Shanghai, she was sure. And certainly none reached the villages in China's interior, where mourners had prayerfully sent them. The body these were meant to accompany had probably sunk to the bottom already.
The first time Elena had seen this soft white hope on the river, Johann had been holding her hand, pointing the flowers out. Johann had learned about the burials in their first months in Shanghai, when Elena was still learning about the stench of the river, about the insects and billowing heat of summer, the coal smoke and cold of winter, the rains and never-ending damp of all seasons, about hunger and noise and the crush of people whose words she didn't understand.
Johann said Chinese ghosts could only find rest among their ancestors in their family villages. People from the interior who died in Shanghai were sent home for burial. The well-to-do placed the coffins on ox carts for the long trek. The poor couldn't even afford the coffins. They sprinkled their dead with flowers, brought them to the riverbank, and slipped them gently into the water to make their own way home.
Jews can rest anywhere while we wait for the Messiah, Johann said. It's lucky for us, since we have no home.
Johann rested now, waiting in the Israeli cemetery on Point Road. A shout broke above the honking and the traffic behind her. Elena turned. The Japanese guard was stabbing at the air with his bayonet, ordering her to move on. She hunched her shoulders and rejoined the crowd, trudging along the rusted steel grate of the garden bridge.
At home in Prague, Johann had been wrong. They had once had a home. They lived in a tiny house, and Elena had a tiny garden. She'd grown roses, red ones and pink ones and white ones, pale and ghostly as the chrysanthemums in this river. They cascaded over the front fence for all who passed by to see.
In Shanghai, the gardens hid behind walls, waved the tops of their trees like teasing fingers above solid brick, poured the scent of unseen flowers into the air in areas where Jews were not permitted to walk.
At the far side of the bridge, where it gave onto the Bund, the flow of the crowd narrowed and slowed. Elena peered to see the reason. Outside the guard station, 3 Chinese women lay flat on the walkway, touching their foreheads to the cold steel and kowtows to the Japanese guards, who berated them in a language the women did not understand, for infractions they probably had not committed. The rain was now falling hard. The women's clothes were heavy, sodden. One shivered uncontrollably, but none were allowed to rise. When, finally, the shivering one looked up, one of the guards, small and thin and enveloped in his oilcloth raincoat, kicked her in the mouth. Bleeding now, weeping silently, the woman returned to her kowtow. The other 2 did not move. Elena walked on. Scenes like these played out across Shanghai every minute of every day. The Chinese and the Japanese shared a mutual burning hatred as deep as any cold-eyed Aryan's hatred of Jews. The Japanese ruled China now, with a casual brutality toward the Chinese that had ignited Johann's fury. Elena, terrified, had pulled him away from a confrontation with Japanese soldiers more than once, as she had from brown shirts in the streets of Prague.
"You'll get killed," she pleaded with him, here as she had there, "and no one will be saved."
In Johann's final days, the Shema on his lips as he lay devoured by the typhoid fever sweeping through the ghetto, Elena had been struck by this bitter thought. She had prevented him from dying a hero, but she could not prevent him from dying. Elena trudged on. Last month there was a day in which the Japanese commandant of the Jewish ghetto, feeling dyspeptic, abruptly left his office before an hour had ended. The long line of people waiting to see him was angrily told to disperse, as though their coming had caused the major's illness. Those who had not yet gotten their passes could not leave the ghetto that week for work or school, the only reasons Jews could leave at all. Elena was among them. It was a week of more hunger than usual, more hours spent staring at the wall in the tiny attic room, huddled in the blanket, trying to stay warm. Through a schoolboy fortunate enough to have been at the head of the line, Elena sent a message to the French couturier in Fuchow Road for whom she worked, informing him what had happened and begging him to retain Elena's position until she could return. The following week, when she'd gotten a pass again, Elena sewed as late into the night as the pass allowed. She made up all the work she'd missed, left the shop each night with burning eyes and a pounding head, and also took with her the understanding that were it to happen again, Monsieur Fournier would have no choice but to replace her with a Chinese girl.
The Chinese have no understanding of fashion, Monsieur Fournier said. I much prefer employing a European, even a Jew, who values the art of couture. But my customers must not be kept waiting, and the Chinese girls can handle the needle and will do as they are told.
Elena, who could no longer remember what value couture had at all, except to keep her, barely, from starving, nodded dumbly and bent to her sewing.
Work and study. Those are the only reasons Jews could leave the ghetto, with the exception of funerals. That concession had allowed Elena to bury Johann in sanctified ground, but she had not been permitted back to the cemetery in 6 months since. Perhaps that was to the good.
In Prague, Elena had gone every Shabbos to her parents' graves. Beside a nearby headstone, a thin, pale widow could be found, sitting and talking to her late husband. She gave him news of the children and asked his advice.
Elena now walked in the world without Johann. Bereft and dazed in this city he had come to love, and she to loathe, in the short years of their life together here, she feared her longing might drive her to do the same, to spend her days near him and her nights also, were she once permitted to visit the place where he now lay.
Though they had no children of whom to bring him news, Johann had hoped that they would, had wanted to start their family in China, to triumphantly return to Prague when the war ended, with children born in exile, as proof the Jews could not be destroyed. But in the 3 years of their life in China, as in their single year in the tiny house in Prague, before the fires and smashed windows and jackboots forced their desperate flight, Elena had not conceived.
And what advice could she ask Johann for? What could he offer? Advice implied a choice to be made. For Elena, Shanghai offered no choices, just a daily struggle to live, to eat, to stay warm in winter, to breathe in summer. A drowning swimmer doesn't need advice on how furiously to stroke. Elena clutched her worn wool coat more closely in the spitting rain. Her past required her to walk along Nanking Road, and while she usually kept to the far side of the street, today, in her weariness, she sheltered under the colonnade. She avoided this arched walkway when she could, so as not to pass the former Grand Café, now a German beer hall.
The Grand Café had relocated to Hangzhou when all Jews and their businesses had been compelled to, and it was doing well enough. But in this first location, she and Johann, desperately poor but still full of hope, had spent what Elena even now recalled as happy Sunday afternoons. The cafe smelled of coffee and cinnamon. Yiddish was the language of the menus and the signs. They could barely pay the rent on the one room they lived in, but she and Johann, nevertheless, came nearly every week to the Grand Café for Café mit Schlag and a shared piece of chocolate torte. That night and the next, there would be no dinner, but boiled rice. But Elena would sit with her back to the window so she could not see China. And sometimes there was news of home or of the war. Sometimes Herr Baumann played his violin. And always the ardent discussions of Zionism and atheism and art of God and no God and the death of God, the raised Yiddish voices and the glass pastry cake. And the hubbub made Elena think for a moment, not that she was back in Prague, never that, but that life would again be possible someday.
It would not. Johann was gone. The war continued. The stories whispered out of Europe so horror-drenched that Elena would no longer hear them. She had not read a Yiddish newspaper since Johann's death. She did not visit the new Grand Café. She did not go to shul, to the mikveh. She could not go to the cemetery. She went to work, to her room. To work again. She cooked her rice, and sometimes a carrot or an onion. She bought boiling water from the boy across the street and made tea. There was no sugar, no milk. The rain pounded through the night and into the morning. Weak daylight leaked into Elena's room as she struggled to put on her still damp coat. Without breakfast, because she had nothing left to eat. Without tea, because she had no coins for the boiling water boy. Elena headed once again through the streets of the ghetto.
Always, she took the same path to the garden bridge, although in the ghetto, and only here, a Jew was free to make choices. She would spend the day sewing silk gowns and wool skirts for German and French officers' wives. Today, she would be paid, so she would have rice to eat tonight.
On the river, the roofs of the sampans ran with water. The Pullman's wide straw hats dripped rain onto their thin backs. No blossoms floated today.
Jewish schoolchildren, for whom Shanghai was more than a tangle of reek and damp, of aching for the past and dread of the future, skipped along the walkway with their satchels.
In front of Elena, a married couple held hands and spoke quietly, heads inclined toward one another. The day would separate them, but they would return to each other in the evening. They would sit together over tea.
A trickle of icy water inched down Elena's neck. She didn't reach to tighten her collar. As the rain drove down harder, the paces of people around her quickened. Elena found she could not bring her feet to move faster. She was soaked and cold, and she did not feel strong. A commotion at the end of the bridge spread the crowd like pond ripples moving back from a thrown stone. People slipped around the shouting if they could. A wave surged back from it. As much as Elena could not speed her steps, she also found she could not slow them. She continued mechanically trudging and passed through the slackened and the stopped, to find herself at the guard station, looking on with a group of her fellows as the thin, oilcloth-coated guard cursed and kicked a bundle on the steel grate. The bundle cried out, and Elena saw it was a Chinese woman, weeping, her arms trying uselessly to protect both her head and her pregnant belly. 3 Chinese men struggled to hold a fourth, who shouted her name and pulled against their grip, desperate to reach her. Dully, Elena thought,
That must be her husband. That must be their child, being stomped from her womb.
his friends were right to hold him, though. Attacking the guard would certainly mean death. Elena had not been able to speed nor slow. Now she could not stop. With a howl, she flew at the shocked guard, thrust him away, nearly knocked him over.
Run! Go!
Of course she spoke in Yiddish, and of course the girl did not understand. But as the guard's oilcloth slithered in Elena's grip, the girl staggered to her feet. The crowd parted for her and then came together again, with the finality of the Red Sea drowning the soldiers of Egypt. The girl, her husband, his friends, all disappeared. Gloved hands and oilcloths and enraged Japanese faces swirled around Elena. A guard behind her seized her coat, but she released the buttons, and in her thin blouse, she ran not along the walkway, but 3 steps across it to the railing. A foot in the grill and one on the rail, and she was standing high. One teetering moment. Then a hand grabbed her ankle, and she half turned. A snarling guard shouted an order. Her free foot kicked out, catching him in the eye. He stumbled back, letting her go. She swayed. She desperately tried to maintain her balance so she could turn back to face the river. She would do this. It would not be done to her. Surprised to hear her own voice repeating the Shema, Elena stepped off the garden bridge. She spread her arms wide to embrace the cold black water, where today no blossoms floated.